Hello and welcome to Soul Food. Today we're looking at the book of Daniel, and my subtitle is Who Do We Serve, Who Do We Worship, or Who Is It That We Serve, Who Is It That We Worship? This is something of a golden thread that's running through the whole of the book, so I want you to bear that in mind as we go through. What I propose to do is a little introduction, which we're actually doing now. An overview of the book of Daniel, give you some reasons to read, study and try to understand some of the complex imagery within the book. And then finally we'll look at a couple of specific prophecies, one from Daniel chapter 9 and one from Daniel chapter 7. So, as an introduction, the first thing to say is that the authorship of the book of Daniel is attributed to Daniel. It says in Daniel chapter 8 verse 1, in the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. He's clearly reporting in the first person and claiming authorship of this text. And we have a book that spans really several decades, from about 600 BC through to most of that century, and the timeline is courtesy of Scott, who's put it together, and you can see there where the various events throughout the book appear through that century. There's lots of familiar stories in the book of Daniel, and many of us who've been raised in Sunday school will know these. There's the story of the fiery furnace, the lion's den, the writing on the wall, and even a nod to vegetarianism. I'm not going to look in any great detail at any of those stories. If you want to read about them, they're there. You can open the book and read them yourself. But the backdrop for this whole book of the Bible is that it takes place during a period of judgment on Israel. There's a contrast all the way through between the idolatry of the culture of Babylon with the faithful purity of Daniel and his friends. The pagan backdrop emphasizes the supreme authority of God and of the Messiah and of the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the Messiah. And as I've mentioned earlier, it spans around 70 years or so. Israel is guilty of idolatry, of intermarrying, of oppressing the poor, of injustice, of being unfaithful to the God who claims them. And the prophets were sent as a warning, and the nation had ignored these warnings, and so they are evicted from the land. And Jerusalem is besieged, the temple is plundered, the city is sacked, and the population is taken to Babylon in captivity. And so we can read in Daniel chapter 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. And it seems that there were possibly 3 deportations around 605 BC, 597 and 586 BC. And what they did was they selected the best and brightest of the Israelites to serve in the government and in the palace. So again, in Daniel 1:6 we read, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah. And it's interesting that most of us will remember the name of Daniel, but we'll forget the names of his 3 friends because we know them better by the new names they were given. Daniel we still know as Daniel, even though he was renamed Belteshazzar. But Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. So there's a process of cultural appropriation. They were given new names. They had to learn a new language. They spoke Hebrew. The common tongue was Aramaic. Perhaps they were brainwashed. There were attempts to assimilate them into the culture of the society in which they'd been removed. Daniel lived there throughout the 70 years of exile, and rose to high office as one of 3 administrators over the provincial governors of the entire kingdom. The book is 12 chapters long, and it's an interesting structure. 6 chapters are narrative. They tell the story. 6 chapters are prophetic. You might even say apocalyptic. This, to the Jews, is similar to the Christian interpretation of Revelation, and there's many parallels between those two books. And there's a transition from history in the first 6 chapters into messianic prophecy in the final chapters of the book. It's also interesting to note that Daniel chapters 2 to 7 are written in Aramaic. And the way these chapters are structured is a palindrome. They're in parallel. Let me explain. So, for example, chapter 2 is mirrored in chapter 7. Chapter 3 is mirrored in chapter 6. And chapters 4 and 5 have many parallels as well. So, in chapter 2, there is a story of the king having a dream. In chapter 7, Daniel has a vision. The king's dream in chapter 2 is of a statue that's divided into 4 parts. In Daniel's dream, there are 4 beasts. In chapter 2, there is a heavenly sent rock that destroys the statue and then becomes enormous like a mountain. In chapter 7, there's one like the Son of Man who defeats the 4 beasts who are 4 kings of empires. And chapter 2 ends with the establishment of an eternal kingdom, as does chapter 7. The 4 beasts in chapter 7 and the 4 stages of the statue are represented as 4 empires. Babylon, the Medes and Persians, the Greeks, and then lastly the Romans. If we move on to chapters 3 and 6, in chapter 3 the story is of Daniel's 3 friends refusing to worship the false gods of Babylon. In chapter 6, Daniel refuses to bow down and worship the king, Darius. The penalty for their refusal, in chapter 3, the 3 friends are placed in the fiery furnace. In chapter 6, Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. The 3 friends are rescued or accompanied by an angel in their fiery furnace. And in chapter 6, Daniel is accompanied by an angel who stops up the mouths of the lions. And the culmination of both these miraculous rescues is that the king in chapter 3 glorifies the God of Israel. And similarly in chapter 6, the king, Darius, glorifies the God of Daniel, the God of Israel. And so we come to the central part of the Aramaic text, chapters 4 and 5. And in those chapters we have a proud king of Babylon in both of them. In chapter 4, Daniel interprets the king's dream. Whereas in chapter 5, he interprets the writing on the wall. In chapter 4, God humbles the king. He becomes like a beast of the field. He loses his humanity, becomes, to all intents and purposes, mad. In chapter 5, God humbles the king in that he is killed that very night. So in chapter 4, the humbling of the king is for a period of time because eventually he is restored back to his right senses and back to a position of authority. Whereas in chapter 5, the king is permanently humbled. And so if we carry on then through this book, we see in chapter 8 further visions of a ram and a goat. The ram representing the Medes and the Persians, and the goat is often interpreted as representing the Greeks, and particularly in the form of Alexander. I like to think of him as Alexander the Goat, the greatest of all time, because that was what he was known as, Alexander the Great. And in chapter 9, we see Daniel reading from the scroll of Jeremiah and longing for the end of the exile. It's been 70 years that he's been away from his home in this strange environment. And as he prays for the end of the exile, so we see a bigger vision being revealed, and we'll come to look at that in the second half of this talk. So in chapters 10 to 12, there's some complicated imagery which is talking about these end times, maybe about Antiochus Epiphanes, who reputedly slaughtered pigs in the temple and made other people slaughter pigs in the temple to bring an abomination into that sacred space. And so we see this talk of end times, of judgment, of God bringing things to a conclusion. And so that we've had the introduction and a little overview of the book, and now some reasons to read and study and understand what Daniel is saying. One reason is because it's an example of how you can live faithfully in a society and culture that is at odds with belief in the living God. It's an example to us of the fragility and temporary nature of worldly success and power. As I mentioned at the beginning, it poses to us the question, who is it that we serve or worship? The Aramaic word for that is pilak, and we'll come to that later on in the talk. There are loads of fulfilled prophecy. If you want to find a book that has prophecies fulfilled, this is the book to go to. And yet there are some still to be fulfilled, and understanding those prophecies may be valuable to us as we look to God's kingdom being established. Another reason is because Jesus points his followers to Daniel when he's talking about the destruction of the second temple. He says this, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Matthew 24:15. Let the reader take note. Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. Jesus is pointing us to this book as a reason to take note, to understand about the destruction of the temple, the end times, and also the identity and the coming of the Messiah. So moving on, we've had the introduction, the overview. I've posed some reasons that I think this is a valuable book to read, study and understand. And now for the second half of the talk, we're going to focus a little bit on two particular prophecies in Daniel 9 and Daniel 7. Recently I joined with some friends that I hadn't met for some years. As a student, I lived in a house in Liverpool with 5 other friends, and we'd not been together since 1991. So we had a reunion just a few weeks ago where we met together. One of my friends is a secular Jew who is a reporter for the Sun newspaper. Another of my friends is a troublemaker. And as we sat enjoying our meal together, chatting and catching up, he posed the question of the problems in Gaza. And a slightly heated debate ensued. And the conclusion that people drew was that there was no solution to the issues in Gaza. But I interrupted. They know I'm a Christian, and I said that I believe there is a solution. The solution I proposed was this, that the Jews are looking for the Messiah and longing for his coming. As a Christian, I believe they missed him when he came. In Islam, they proclaim Jesus as Messiah, but have no clue as to who he really is or what Messiah means. And as a Christian, I know that when I read in Isaiah that unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Prince of Peace. That if only the Jews and the Muslims recognised Messiah, the Prince of Peace, then there could be reconciliation and peace and a solution to all the problems, including that of Gaza. And it's one of those questions that I've often wondered. Why is it, for example, when they read Daniel, that the Jews do not recognise in Jesus the fulfilment of these prophecies? It's interesting because I actually think we've got good evidence that Jews of the Second Temple era did recognise that the claim of Messiah was writ large in the book of Daniel. So, as I mentioned at the close of the first half, Jesus draws our attention to the destruction of the temple. And in chapter 9, Daniel gives us a chronology leading to that event and the coming of the Messiah. Jesus tells us to take note. And even the Jewish commentator Rashi, a 12th century French rabbi, recognized this to be a messianic prophecy. So when we read Daniel 9 verse 24, these are the words we see. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. The 77s are thought to be 70 periods of 7 years. This is Daniel looking to the 70 years of exile and being told this greater vision of something more important than just the restoration of Israel back to Jerusalem. And this chronology that's there in the book of Daniel has been used to calculate all kinds of things, to calculate the time of Jesus' death, to calculate the destruction of the Second Temple. The problem is that we don't know from when the 77s actually start. It's debatable. People have published academic papers and books to try and justify their own theories as to what this is all about. Some people have said actually that a prophetic year isn't 365 days, it's only 360 days. And so that alters the chronology. Some people think there may be gaps in those 77s when it talks about the 62 sevens and then another 7 sevens and then another. So are there gaps between these periods of time? Are there possibly 2 anointed ones? Antiochus? Jesus? Meshua? Lots of assumptions and speculations. I don't want to get lost in all of that theory. What I do know is this, that Daniel 9 gives us a final end point, which is the destruction of the Second Temple. I would also say this, that given that we know that this prophecy ends with the destruction of the temple, if it's a messianic prophecy, then Messiah has to come before that date. And so when I look at Daniel 9 verse 24, I can only see the prophecy being fulfilled by one person, by Jesus and only Jesus. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city. To finish transgression. The final sin of Israel, I believe, is the rejection of Messiah. And he puts an end to that transgression. To put an end to sin. And there is Jesus, the perfect sin offering. To atone for wickedness. Jesus is our atonement, the perfect atonement. He establishes righteousness to bring in everlasting righteousness. And to seal up vision and prophecy, Jesus, the seal of the prophets and of visions, the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And to anoint the most holy place. Jesus, I believe, is both king and high priest. To anoint the most holy, to be sanctified and set apart, as Peter preached in Acts, when he, on the day of Pentecost, he went out and said these words, that this Jesus whom you crucified, God has made both Lord and Christ, Messiah. And shortly after, within a generation, the second temple is destroyed, as prophesied by Daniel. And there are other Daniel prophecies that are believed to culminate with the Roman Empire, as did the destruction of the second temple. This is a Jewish interpretation of Daniel. It's also a Christian interpretation, and yet they have missed the Messiah. But there is a problem with this theory, because Messiah is also meant to establish an eternal kingdom. If we go to Daniel 2, verses 44 to 45, we read this: in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. The Jewish commentator Rabbi Rashi in the 12th century said this in his commentary on that passage: in the day of these kings, when the kingdom of Rome is still in existence, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom, the kingdom of the Holy One. Blessed be he, which will never be destroyed, is the kingdom of the Messiah. It will crumble and destroy all these kingdoms. So we have in Daniel chapter 9 a prophecy of Messiah. A Messiah who must come before the end of the destruction of the second temple. A prophecy that I think fits almost perfectly with Jesus. But we have the question of the establishment of the eternal kingdom. So we move on now to Daniel chapter 7, where we encounter one like the Son of Man. And the question is posed, who is this? In Matthew 24, when talking about signs of the end of the age, Jesus says this: then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Who is this? So Daniel 7, 13 and 14. Daniel says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Jesus, in discussing the end of the age, draws our attention to the prophecy in Daniel. Who is one like a son of man? Well, if we read the New Testament, it's clear that this is Jesus. In Matthew 26, Jesus stands before the Sanhedrin, and the high priest in verse 63 says this: "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied, "but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy." Why did the high priest react in such a way? They asked, was Jesus the Son of God? For Jews, many people claimed to be sons of God. Moses told them that they were sons of God. Throughout the Old Testament, we read of the Jewish people as being sons of God. Why was this such a violent reaction when Jesus mentioned the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory? Because the Second Temple Jews understood Daniel's words to be a claim to be the divine Messiah. If we read on in Acts 7, Stephen, again before the Sanhedrin, on trial, says these words in verse 55. "But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. 'Look,' he said, 'I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.' At this, they, the Sanhedrin, covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him." They understood the claim of who the Son of Man was. And in John's Revelation, chapter 1, verse 7, we see this: "Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him." From the New Testament, we can see that for the Second Temple Jews and for the first Christians, the figure of the Son of Man was claimed by Jesus. And it's interesting, isn't it, that people say, well, why don't the Jews believe in him? Well, I'm often reminding myself that the first Christians were Jews. All the disciples were Jews. Jesus is a Jewish Messiah. And we as Gentiles are the ones who are grafted in as sons by adoption rather than by birthright. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jews had to reinvent their theology and their faith because they could no longer follow the sacrificial system. And so Rabbinic Judaism was born. And I think one of the reasons that the Jews today do not recognize the truth of the prophecy in Daniel is because they don't really understand their scriptures anymore. They take their rabbinic words to be of greater value than the words of the Torah and the Talmud. And they have some objections to the New Testament claim that Jesus is one like a Son of Man. I proposed them 3 objections. One is that they claim, a little bit like they do for the suffering servant in Isaiah, that one like the Son of Man is Israel, the nation itself. There is a suggestion that the claim the Son of Man is not a divine claim, but a claim of an entirely human Messiah. And thirdly, they claim that Jesus cannot be the Messiah because no eternal kingdom has been established as yet. So let's go to the first objection. Is one like the Son of Man Israel? And they come to this by looking at the text of Daniel, of Daniel chapter 7. And if we read there, we can see in verse 18, But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. And so they are claiming that the holy people of the Most High are one like a Son of Man. Again, we read in verse 27, then the sovereignty, power and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. So is it possible that the holy people of the Most High are one like the Son of Man? How do we respond to that claim? Well, I think there are a few things we can say in response. The first thing I would say is that the one like the Son of Man must be a king. The four great beasts that Daniel saw in his vision, the four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth. The one to defeat those kings and destroy those kingdoms must be a king over Israel. The second objection is that the holy people receive the kingdom from one like a Son of Man, and that is not the Ancient of Days. Now, this takes a little bit of explanation because not all translations of the Bible into English make this distinction clear. If you remember, we said that Daniel chapters 2 to 7 are written in Aramaic. For Daniel 7:18 and Israel to be the interpretation as one like the Son of Man, the highest one that is written there has to be the Ancient of Days. But in the book of Daniel, there are two similar but different words used for the divine exalted status. One is Elijah. I hope I've not done too much disservice to the Aramaic, which means the Most High. The second is Elyonin, a plural of majesty, similar to Elohim in Hebrew. It's worth noting that if you go to the original text, Most High, Elijah, is used 9 times between Daniel's chapters 3 to 6, but only once in Daniel 7. Whereas the highest one, Elyonin, is used 4 times, but only in Daniel 7, and only after the vision of the one like the Son of Man. So why is this important? Because these words are trying to distinguish between the divine status of two individuals. Elijah, the Most High, Elyonin, the highest one. There are 2 exalted figures in Daniel 7, and so these different words are used to distinguish them one from another. And so the Ancient of Days is the Most High, and the one like the Son of Man is the highest one. And therefore it cannot be a nation that is the one like the Son of Man. It is an individual divine character. The third objection is this, that the whole theology of the book of Daniel is based upon that question that I mentioned at the beginning. Who do the people serve? Who do we worship? Those early chapters where the Israelites were asked to bow down to a statue, or in later chapters to the king, they refused to do it. The word there for service or worship is pelak, and it's used exclusively in the term of worshipping or serving gods, either true or false gods. And so we can read that Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not pelak, serve my gods, or pelak, the image of gold I have set up?" And Nebuchadnezzar said also, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refused to the golden statue. Daniel refuses to Darius the king in Daniel 6. It would therefore be nonsense that all the tribes, tongues and nations would the nation of Israel. So therefore one like the Son of Man cannot be Israel, and it must be the Messiah. We understand this too because the Jewish interpretation has always been that this is a messianic prophecy. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, in his discussions on the contradictions between the Messiah being one like a son of man riding on the clouds in Daniel 7, and the Messiah being lowly and mounted on a donkey, the foal of a colt in Zechariah 9 verses 9, says these are contradictory accounts of the Messiah. I'm not going into the detail of that now, but clearly they see this as a messianic prophecy. So the second possible objection is that the Son of Man is an entirely human title. The Son of Man is used throughout Scripture on multiple occasions, not least in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 2, the prophet himself is described as the Son of Man when he is told to stand on your feet that I may speak with you. And the phrase occurs 90 times in the book of Ezekiel. And it should be possible to serve a human Messiah as a human king. In Jeremiah 27, we read that the wild animals and nations serve Nebuchadnezzar. But you see, in Daniel, we've got to put it into the right context. The context here is absolutely vital. The whole thread of the book is, who do we serve? Who do we Is it the false gods set up by the kings and the humans and the authorities? Do we bow down and worship Darius, a human king? Or do we worship the true God, the immortal one, the God of Israel? It's about false worship versus true worship. It would make no sense for the one like the Son of Man to be worshipped if they were entirely human. It's interesting to note that the reason that the Sanhedrin saw Jesus as blaspheming was not because he claimed to be a son of God, but because he claimed to be the Son of Man. And we read in Daniel 7:14 that the Son of Man was given authority, glory and sovereign power, that all nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. So in the same way that it would be foolish for this to be the nation of Israel who's the Son of Man, so a human would also be contradictory to the whole context of the book of Daniel. And so we move on to the third objection, that it cannot be Jesus because we are still awaiting the establishment of the eternal kingdom. If we go back to the book of Acts, we can see that when Jesus rose from the dead, his disciples were expecting that kingdom to be established. Acts chapter 1:6 says, "Then they gathered around him and asked him, 'Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?' But Jesus said to them, 'It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority.'" The eternal kingdom, according to those words, is a future event. If we look at that earlier contradiction that I mentioned that they were discussing, where Daniel 7 depicts the Messiah coming on the clouds and Zechariah 9 riding on a donkey, how can we resolve that contradiction? The Jews would say, well, if Israel is faithful, so the Messiah will come riding on the clouds. If they are unfaithful, he will come riding on a donkey. But as a Christian who believes in Jesus as Messiah, I can also say that the Messiah can come twice. once humble, mounted on a donkey, but at a future event, in majesty, riding on the clouds. The first coming has been fulfilled. And so if we go back to Daniel 9, we read, 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy to the most holy place. Jesus fulfilled that. And then we can claim that Daniel's 7:13 to 14 will be fulfilled when he comes again. And there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And we know, don't we, that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow when he comes again. And it is that coming that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 26 before the Sanhedrin. And it's that coming that is spoken of in Revelation chapter 1. Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, and even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him. And that makes me think and reflect a little bit on a prophecy in Zechariah 12, when in verse 10 it reads, I will pour out on the house of David, on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn. Those Jews who missed the first coming, who pierced their Messiah, when he comes riding on the clouds, will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, the one they have pierced. And so, we've been through the introduction. We've looked at the book as an overview. There are some reasons to read, study, and understand. What do we think of the book of Daniel? It demonstrates the faithfulness of those who would follow God in a hostile society, culture, and world. It asks a question of us: who do we serve? Who do we worship? Who do we palach? It asks, who is it that we serve? Who is it that we worship? It's a book that prophesies the first coming of the Messiah, 600 years before Jesus arrives on the scene in first century Palestine. And it prophesies the expectation and the establishment of his kingdom of peace, 2,600 years and counting. The book ends with words that say that the prophecies of Daniel were to be sealed. It's worth studying them because whilst many have been fulfilled, there is this one yet to come. And given the success and truthfulness of the prophecies that we read in Daniel, why should we doubt the validity of the one yet to be fulfilled? There is another book of the Bible that was sealed at its end, and that's in John's later vision. And as we study the words of Daniel, I'm reminded of Revelation 22, verse 20. He who testifies to these things says, yes, I am coming soon. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus.